On what should be the happiest day of her life, Sophie's world unravels when a dark secret from her fiancé's past emerges at the altar. As her trust is shattered, Sophie is forced to confront the lies that threaten to destroy her future. It was a beautiful day, one that Sophie had envisioned countless times in her dreams. The grand church stood tall, adorned with flowers and elegant decorations, as if the world itself had conspired to make this the most magical day of her life. Rows of pews were filled with friends and family, all eager to witness the union of Sophie and Edward. Laughter and whispers of excitement filled the air, and Sophie's heart raced with joy as she stood beside the man she loved, her hand gently resting in his. Edward. The name itself brought a smile to her lips. He was everything she had ever wanted. Charming, kind, and dependable. She had always known their love was special, the kind that poets wrote about, the kind that felt like it would last forever. Today was the culmination of that love, the moment they would vow to be together for the rest of their lives. As the ceremony progressed, the priest's words seemed to float in the air, sweet and timeless, matching the joyful rhythm of Sophie's heart. She couldn't help but glance at Edward, who smiled at her with a warmth that reassured her of everything they had built together. His gaze was steady, his touch firm. This was perfect, she thought. It was everything she had hoped it would be. But then, something shifted. The large wooden doors of the church creaked open, echoing ominously through the sacred hall. Heads turned, and murmurs spread across the pews like wildfire. Sophie, still wrapped in the bliss of the moment, followed the gazes of the guests. Standing in the doorway was a woman, striking, with long dark hair and a deep expression of determination. She was holding the hand of a small boy, no more than 4 or 5 years old. The woman hesitated for a moment, then began walking down the aisle toward the altar. Sophie felt a knot form in her stomach. Who was this woman? And why did she feel an overwhelming sense of dread as the woman approached? She tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the joy of the day. Surely, there was a simple explanation for this intrusion. Perhaps the woman was lost or late to the ceremony. But the uneasy feeling in Sophie's chest only grew. Edward's grip on her hand tightened, and Sophie turned to look at him. His face had changed. The warmth and confidence that had reassured her just moments ago had vanished. His expression was one of sheer panic. His skin had turned pale, and his eyes darted frantically between the approaching woman and Sophie, as if searching for an escape. "Edward," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Who is she?" Edward didn't answer. He stood frozen, staring at the woman as if he had seen a ghost. The atmosphere in the church shifted from joy to tension. The guests, once smiling and chatting, were now silent, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The woman reached the front of the church, stopping just a few feet from the altar. Her gaze was fixed on Edward, and there was something in her eyes. Something that terrified Sophie even more than the sudden interruption. Sophie's pulse quickened as she looked at Edward, silently pleading for an explanation. But all she saw in his eyes was fear and guilt. The small boy at the woman's side stared up at Edward with wide, innocent eyes. Sophie's heart sank as a horrifying realization began to creep into her mind. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was something much worse. The woman took a deep breath, her voice shaking slightly as she finally spoke. "Edward," she said, her words cutting through the thick tension in the room. "You can't ignore us anymore." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Edward, desperately seeking an answer. The church was now deathly quiet, all eyes on the drama unfolding at the altar. But Edward still said nothing. And in that moment, Sophie knew. This was only the beginning of a nightmare she never saw coming. The church was silent. Every guest, every eye, was focused on the scene unfolding at the altar. The woman stood there, holding the hand of the small boy, her gaze never leaving Edward. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, waiting for her reaction, but she was frozen, her breath shallow, barely able to process the woman's words. "You can't ignore us anymore." Sophie's voice finally broke through her shock. "Edward," she whispered, her voice barely audible. What is she talking about?" Her eyes locked onto Edward, pleading for him to say something, to explain this away, to make everything right again. But Edward's face told a different story. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. His eyes darted from the woman to Sophie, and she saw it, the raw guilt that had overtaken him. Sophie felt a cold wave of dread crash over her. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Edward took a shaky step forward, his hand slipping from Sophie's. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the woman stepped forward, her voice firmer now, full of pain but also resolve. "Edward," she said again, "he deserves to know. He deserves to be part of your life." She looked down at the boy, who clung to her leg, confused by the intensity in the air but obediently silent. The boy. Sophie's eyes darted to him, and in that split second, it hit her. The truth crashed down on her like a sledgehammer. The boy. He was Edward's. Sophie's legs felt weak, her vision swimming as she struggled to keep her composure. Her mind screamed for this to be a lie, for someone to wake her up from this living nightmare. But deep down, she knew the truth. She could see it in Edward's face, in the woman's eyes. This was no stranger. This wasn't some misunderstanding. The woman, the boy, Edward's son, were real, and they were here to shatter everything she thought she knew. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice trembling. "Sophie, I'm so sorry." His eyes were filled with anguish, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want this to come out like this. Not today. Not like this." Sophie took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. "Not like this," she repeated, her voice rising. She was suddenly aware of how tight her chest felt, how hard it was to breathe. "Edward, what is she saying? Is that boy your?" Edward looked at her, and for a moment, it was as if he couldn't bear the weight of her gaze. He looked down, guilt flooding his face as he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "Yes, Sophie, he's my son." The words echoed in Sophie's ears, as if they had been spoken in slow motion. She felt her whole world crumbling around her, piece by piece. The perfect day, the perfect wedding, the perfect man. All of it was a lie. Her legs nearly gave out as she stumbled backward, grabbing onto the altar for support. The guests were frozen in their seats, horrified expressions on their faces, unsure of whether to intervene or remain silent. Sophie's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "How could you keep something like this from me?" She was looking at Edward, but he didn't meet her eyes. He couldn't. Edward took a deep breath, stepping forward as if to reach for her, but Sophie instinctively pulled away. "Sophie, I didn't know how to tell you," he said, his voice full of desperation. "It was before we met. I didn't want to lose you. I thought if you knew, you wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" Sophie interrupted, her voice now trembling with anger. "Wouldn't love you? Wouldn't marry you?" She felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "You lied to me, Edward. You kept this from me, and now you expect me to just, what? Accept this? Accept that you have a child with another woman?" The tension in the church was suffocating. The guests were glued to their seats, some with their hands over their mouths, others exchanging anxious glances. The priest, who had been standing silently at the altar, looked deeply uncomfortable, unsure of how to proceed. Edward's eyes glistened with tears, his face a mask of regret. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he whispered. "I was going to tell you, I swear. I just didn't know how. I was scared of losing you." Sophie let out a bitter laugh, the sound cutting through the heavy silence in the room. "You were scared of losing me?" she repeated, her voice rising with every word. "You should have been scared of losing my trust. You should have been honest with me, Edward. This isn't something you hide." The woman, still standing beside the boy, finally spoke again, her voice calm but laced with emotion. "I didn't come here to ruin your wedding, Sophie, but Edward needs to be a part of his son's life. I've tried to reach out to him, but he kept avoiding it. I had no choice but to come here." Sophie's eyes widened as the woman's words sank in. He's known? He's known about the boy this whole time?" Her voice cracked, and the room felt like it was spinning around her. Edward's head hung low, his silence confirming the worst. He had known. He had lied, not just once, but for years. Sophie's heart shattered into pieces. She felt humiliated, betrayed, exposed in front of everyone she loved. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and now it had become the most painful. "I can't," Sophie whispered, backing away from Edward. "I can't do this." Her voice broke, and the first tear slipped down her cheek. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the church seemed to close in on her, and the weight of the betrayal was too much to bear. Without another word, Sophie turned and fled down the aisle, her vision blurred by tears, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the now silent church. Behind her, Edward stood frozen, watching helplessly as the woman he loved ran out of his life. The church, once filled with joy and laughter, was now a place of stunned silence and broken hearts. Sophie's footsteps echoed down the long church aisle, each step faster than the last as she fled from the altar. Her vision was a blur of tears, and the suffocating weight of betrayal crushed her chest, making it hard to breathe. The whispers of the guests behind her were muffled, barely audible over the pounding in her ears. She pushed open the grand doors of the church, the cool air of the outside world hitting her like a shock. For a brief moment, Sophie stood at the top of the church steps, gasping for breath, her wedding dress clinging to her, the perfect white gown now feeling like a prison. The day had turned into a nightmare she couldn't escape. She ran. The world around her was a blur. The streets, the people passing by, none of it mattered. Her only instinct was to run, to get away from the church, from Edward, from the lie her life had become. Behind her, inside the church, chaos had erupted. Edward stood at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Sophie disappear through the doors. The weight of his actions, the full impact of his betrayal, crashed down on him like a tidal wave. For a moment, he couldn't move. He wanted to run after her, to beg for forgiveness, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The guests had erupted into anxious murmurs, a mix of confusion, shock, and disbelief filling the air. Some were still seated, stunned into silence, while others exchanged uneasy glances or whispered frantically among themselves. What had started as the happiest day of their lives had turned into a public spectacle of heartbreak. Edward's eyes flicked to the woman standing a few feet away from him. The woman with the boy, the mother of his child. She was standing tall, though there was sorrow in her eyes as she looked at Edward. She hadn't wanted this, not like this. "Edward," the woman started, but Edward cut her off, shaking his head. "No," he said quietly, his voice barely audible, "not now." He looked down at the boy, the child he had kept a secret for so long, the child who was now at the center of his broken life. A lump formed in his throat. He knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. But for now, all he could think about was Sophie. He needed to find her, to explain, though deep down, he knew there was no explanation that would fix this. Without another word, Edward stepped away from the altar, leaving the woman and the boy standing in the front of the church. His heart was racing as he hurried through the crowd, pushing past the stunned guests who stared at him with a mix of pity and judgment. "Sophie," he called out as he reached the doors, hoping she hadn't gone far. Outside, the bright sunlight felt harsh against his skin as Edward scanned the street, his heart sinking when he didn't see her. Panic set in. She couldn't have gone far, he thought. She was in a wedding dress, after all. She had to be close. Meanwhile, inside the church, the woman with the child, Rebecca, stood awkwardly, watching Edward leave in pursuit of Sophie. She glanced around the church, seeing the confused, judgmental eyes of the guests on her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and a part of her regretted coming here. But what choice did she have? Edward had been avoiding her for months, refusing to step up as a father. This confrontation was inevitable, even if it had turned into a disaster. Rebecca knelt down beside her son, trying to shield him from the stares of the guests. He was too young to fully understand what was happening, but she could see the unease in his eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice soft as she stroked his hair. "It's going to be okay." But was it? Rebecca wasn't sure anymore. The looks from the guests were unbearable, the weight of the tension in the air pressing down on her. She hadn't wanted to ruin Sophie's day. That had never been her intention, but the truth couldn't be hidden forever. Back on the street, Edward was frantic, rushing down the sidewalk in the direction Sophie had run. He could feel the stares of people as he passed by, the sight of a man in a tuxedo running through the city drawing curious glances. But none of that mattered to him. All he could think about was Sophie and how desperately he needed to explain himself. He finally spotted her. She was sitting on a bench near the edge of a small park, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Edward's heart clenched at the sight. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. It was supposed to be the beginning of their life together. Instead, it was turning into the worst day of their lives. "Sophie," he called out softly as he approached her. Sophie stiffened at the sound of his voice, but she didn't look up. She couldn't. Her whole body trembled as she fought to hold back the sobs that threatened to consume her. Edward sat down beside her, careful to leave a small gap between them. He could feel the tension radiating off of her, the anger and betrayal mixed with heartbreak. "Sophie, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice thick with regret. "I should have told you. I should have been honest with you from the start." Sophie slowly lifted her head, her tear-streaked face filled with pain and disbelief. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "You lied to me, Edward. You lied about everything." Edward ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "It was before we met," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to lose you." Sophie's eyes flashed with anger. "And now look where we are. You've lost me anyway." Her voice grew louder, more desperate. "I was ready to marry you, Edward. I trusted you. And you kept this from me? A child? How could you think I wouldn't care?" Edward's heart shattered at her words. He wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, but he knew it wasn't the right time. "I thought I could handle it," he admitted, his voice full of regret. "I thought if I didn't bring it up, we could move on and just be happy. But I was wrong, Sophie. I was so wrong." Sophie shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. How can I ever trust you again?" Edward felt the weight of her words crushing him. "Sophie, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I love you. I love you more than anything. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "You hurt me more than anyone ever has." There was a long, painful silence between them. Sophie's sobs had quieted, but the raw pain in her eyes was still there, cutting through Edward like a knife. He knew he had shattered her trust, and he didn't know if he could ever fix it. Finally, Sophie stood up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She looked down at Edward, her expression a mixture of heartbreak and finality. "I can't do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not today. Not after everything." Edward stood, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sophie, please," he started, but she cut him off. "Don't," she said softly. "I need time. I need to think. Right now, I can't." With that, Sophie turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone, his heart shattered, his future uncertain. He watched her go, knowing that this was a wound that might never heal. Edward stood frozen, watching Sophie walk away, her wedding dress flowing behind her like a ghost of the life they had planned together. His chest felt heavy, his breaths shallow. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? He had tried to hold on to his perfect world, but now it was all slipping through his fingers. He wanted to run after her, beg her to stay, but he knew she needed time. For the first time in his life, Edward felt utterly powerless. Inside the church, the tension was palpable. Rebecca, still standing near the altar with her son, felt the weight of the guests' stares pressing down on her. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the faces filled with confusion, judgment, and even pity. She hadn't wanted this. Rebecca had tried for months to get Edward to acknowledge his responsibilities, but this wasn't how she had imagined it ending up, disrupting his wedding, becoming the villain in the eyes of so many strangers. The little boy tugged at her sleeve, sensing his mother's distress. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Are we going home now?" Rebecca looked down at him, trying to muster a reassuring smile. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "We're going home." As they began to walk toward the exit, whispers followed them, hushed but sharp enough to sting. Rebecca kept her head high, but inside, she felt exposed, raw. She hadn't wanted to humiliate anyone. She just wanted her son to have what he deserved, a father who acknowledged him. As they stepped out of the church, the warm sunlight hit them, contrasting sharply with the cold tension inside. Rebecca held her son's hand a little tighter, her mind spinning. She had done what she came to do. Now, it was up to Edward to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Back in the park, Edward remained on the bench where Sophie had left him, replaying her words over and over in his mind. His heart ached with guilt and regret. He had thought he could keep his past hidden, protect their future, but in trying to do so, he had destroyed everything. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his daze. He pulled it out, half expecting it to be Sophie, but instead, it was a message from his best man, Greg. "Man, what happened? Where are you?" Edward stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the screen. How could he even begin to explain what had just unfolded? How could he explain that his wedding had turned into a public spectacle, that the woman he loved had just walked out of his life because of secrets he had kept for far too long? He sighed, dropping the phone back into his pocket. Right now, words didn't matter. What mattered was Sophie, and whether or not he could ever make things right with her. Sophie wandered through the city aimlessly, the weight of her wedding dress pulling at her, making each step feel heavier. She had no destination, no clear thought except the pain that gnawed at her heart. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just hours ago, she had been preparing for the happiest day of her life, ready to marry the man she loved. Now, it felt like her entire world had been ripped apart in front of everyone she knew. She found herself in a quiet corner of a park, where she sank onto a wooden bench, burying her face in her hands. Her chest tightened as she tried to hold back the sobs that threatened to overtake her. How could Edward have done this to her? How could he have kept something so important, so monumental, a secret? A child. He had a child she never even knew existed. She thought back to all the moments they had shared, all the promises they had made, and it all felt tainted now, covered in the shadow of his betrayal. She thought of the boy, that innocent little boy who had no idea what was going on, standing beside his mother as the truth tore Sophie's world apart. Sophie wasn't angry at him. He was just a child. But Edward, he had lied to her, deceived her, and made her believe in a life that wasn't real. The hurt was overwhelming. It wasn't just that Edward had a child. It was that he had kept it from her. He had hidden a part of himself, a part of his life that she should have known about. How could she trust him now? Sophie wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming, her chest heaving with the weight of it all. She felt broken, as if the future she had imagined was shattered beyond repair. And yet, deep down, she still loved him. That was the cruelest part of all. As she sat there, lost in her pain, she heard footsteps approaching. Her body tensed, her mind immediately jumping to Edward. She couldn't face him, not yet. But when she looked up, it wasn't Edward at all. It was her best friend, Lila. Lila had been in the church, watching the disaster unfold, and when Sophie had run out, she hadn't hesitated to follow. Now, she stood in front of Sophie, her eyes full of concern, her face etched with worry. "Sophie," Lila said gently, sitting down beside her, "I've been looking for you." Sophie tried to speak, but her throat felt tight. The words stuck. All she could do was shake her head as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Soph," Lila whispered, wrapping her arms around her. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The warmth of Lila's embrace broke something inside Sophie, and she finally let go. Sobbing into her friend's shoulder, Lila held her tight, whispering soothing words, letting Sophie cry as much as she needed to. For what felt like hours, they sat there together, Sophie's heart pouring out in broken sobs as Lila held her, never once letting go. Finally, when the tears began to slow, Sophie pulled back, wiping her eyes with shaky hands. "I don't know what to do," Sophie whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I don't know if I can forgive him. How could he lie to me like that? How could he keep something like that from me?" Lila looked at her with compassion, gently taking Sophie's hand. "I don't have the answers, sophomore. But what I do know is that you don't have to make any decisions right now. You need time to think, to breathe. This is a lot to process." Sophie nodded, her mind swirling with everything that had happened. Lila was right. She couldn't make any decisions now. Everything was too raw, too painful. She needed space, time to figure out how she truly felt. "Let's get you out of this dress," Lila said softly, standing up and offering Sophie her hand. "Come back to my place for now. We'll take it one step at a time." Sophie hesitated, glancing down at the white gown she had once been so excited to wear. Now, it felt like a heavy reminder of what had been lost. Slowly, she took Lila's hand and stood, feeling the weight of the day press down on her. As they walked back through the park, Sophie felt a strange sense of calm settle over her, though the hurt still pulsed beneath the surface. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, all she could do was take it one step at a time. Meanwhile, Edward sat alone in the church, the once joyful space now empty and cold. He stared at the altar where Sophie had once stood beside him, radiant in her wedding dress. The memory of her smile was seared into his mind, but it only made the guilt worse. He had ruined everything. There was no one to blame but himself. Edward buried his face in his hands, the enormity of his mistakes crashing down on him. The weight of his secret, the pain he had caused Sophie, it was all too much. He didn't know if he would ever be able to fix this. And deep down, he feared that he had lost her for good. Sophie sat on the edge of Lila's couch, staring blankly at the cup of tea in her hands. The soft hum of the city outside barely registered as she remained lost in her thoughts, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a crushing fog. The wedding that was supposed to mark the happiest moment of her life had crumbled into heartbreak, betrayal, and public humiliation. She still couldn't wrap her mind around it. Edward, her Edward, had a child with another woman, a child he had kept hidden from her. How could he have thought that she wouldn't care? That he could just sweep something so monumental under the rug and pretend it didn't exist? Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she placed the cup down on the table, her heart aching with confusion and anger. Across from her, Lila sat quietly, giving Sophie space to process. She had been there, following Sophie through every emotional storm, holding her hand when she had broken down completely. Now, Lila just watched her with patient concern, knowing Sophie would speak when she was ready. Sophie finally broke the silence, her voice hoarse from hours of crying. "How could he lie to me like that, Lila? How could he hide a child, his child, from me? What kind of life were we even going to have?" Lila leaned forward, her expression soft but serious. "Sophie, I don't know why he did what he did. I wish I had an answer for you, but I think Edward was scared. He didn't know how to face it, how to face you. But that doesn't excuse what he did." Sophie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Scared? He was more than scared. He was selfish. He thought he could build a life with me and just pretend this other part of his world didn't exist. Like he could keep his son in the shadows, keep that woman away, and we'd just live happily ever after." Her voice cracked, the raw emotion rising again. "But I don't even know who he is anymore, Lila. How could I have been so blind?" Lila reached out and gently took Sophie's hand. "You weren't blind, sophomore. You trusted him. That's what people do when they love someone. You had no reason to doubt him until today." Sophie's eyes welled up with fresh tears, but she quickly wiped them away, trying to hold herself together. "I loved him, Lila. I loved him so much. I thought he was my forever." Lila squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe he still is, Sophie. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that right now, you need to figure out what you want. Not for him, but for yourself." Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. The thought of facing Edward again, of talking about the betrayal, felt unbearable right now. She didn't know if she could forgive him, if she could ever trust him again. But the truth was, a part of her still loved him. No matter how shattered she felt, That love was still there, buried under the hurt. "I just need space," Sophie whispered. "I can't talk to him right now. I need time to think, to figure out what I want. I can't make any decisions when I'm like this." Lila nodded, understanding. "Of course. You take all the time you need. No one's rushing you, and you don't owe anyone anything right now." For a moment, the two friends sat in silence, the weight of Sophie's pain hanging in the air. But as the minutes passed, Sophie's mind began to clear, little by little. She realized she didn't have to decide anything now. She could take things one day at a time, one step at a time. Across town, Edward sat alone in his apartment, the space filled with the silence of his failure. He hadn't even bothered to change out of his tuxedo. He just sat there, staring blankly at the wall, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so terribly wrong. He had lost Sophie. The thought echoed in his mind, relentless and painful. He had kept the truth from her for so long, hoping, foolishly, that he could control the situation. But now, everything was exposed. His son, Rebecca, the secret that had been gnawing at him for years had finally exploded, and the fallout was worse than he had imagined. Edward buried his face in his hands, guilt washing over him in waves. He could still see the look on Sophie's face, the way her heart had shattered right in front of him. He had caused her that pain, had betrayed the woman he loved more than anything in this world. How could he ever fix this? His phone buzzed on the table beside him, the screen lighting up with a message from Greg. "Man, I don't know what to say, but I'm here if you need me." Edward stared at the message, his heart sinking further. He couldn't face anyone, not Greg, not his family, no one. All he wanted was Sophie, but she was gone, and it was his fault. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Edward's head snapped up, his pulse quickening. He stood up, half hoping, half praying that it was Sophie. Maybe she had come back. Maybe she was ready to talk. He rushed to the door and opened it, but instead of Sophie, it was Rebecca standing in the hallway, her expression a mixture of worry and guilt. She had changed out of the dress she had worn to the church and now stood before him in jeans and a sweater, her eyes downcast. "Edward," she began softly, "can I come in?" Edward hesitated, his heart sinking further. He didn't want to deal with this, not now, not after everything that had happened. But he couldn't avoid Rebecca forever. She was part of the mess he had created. He stepped aside, letting her in. Rebecca walked into the living room, glancing around awkwardly before turning to face him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet. "I didn't want it to happen like that. I didn't want to ruin your wedding, but I didn't know what else to do. You've been avoiding me for months, and I had no choice." Edward ran a hand through his hair, his frustration bubbling just below the surface. "Rebecca, I know," he said, his voice strained. "I know you didn't want this, but you have to understand, I didn't either. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to tell Sophie." Rebecca's eyes softened with sympathy. "I understand, but Edward, your son deserves better than this. He deserves to know his father. I'm not saying you and Sophie can't be together, but you can't keep hiding this part of your life." Edward's chest tightened, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him like never before. He looked at Rebecca, guilt flooding him once again. "I know," he whispered. "I know I can't run from this anymore." Rebecca stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not too late, Edward. You can still be the father he needs. And whatever happens with Sophie, that's up to you two to figure out. But you need to make a choice for his sake." Edward nodded, feeling the full weight of her words. He couldn't keep running. He had to face the truth, face his mistakes, and try to make things right. Not just with Sophie, but with his son. Rebecca offered a small, understanding smile. "I'll let you figure things out. But don't wait too long, Edward. You owe it to him." With that, she left, leaving Edward alone once again. But this time, there was a clarity he hadn't had before. He couldn't keep living in denial, couldn't keep pretending the past didn't exist. He had to make things right. But as he sat back down on the couch, the crushing thought returned. Would Sophie ever forgive him? Would she ever give him the chance to prove that he could be the man she needed him to be? And worse, could he ever forgive himself for breaking her heart in the first place? Days passed, and the world outside Sophie's window moved on. But inside, she felt frozen. Each morning, she woke up in Lila's guest room, the weight of the past week pressing down on her like a heavy fog. She had turned off her phone, avoiding the inevitable flood of messages from family, friends, and, most importantly, Edward. Edward had tried to reach out several times. Lila had told her about his calls, his desperate messages asking for a chance to explain, to make things right. But Sophie wasn't ready. The pain was too raw, the wound too fresh. She needed to heal first. Sophie spent her days walking through the city, trying to find some sense of normalcy, some clarity. Her mind kept replaying that day at the church. The moment the doors opened, the woman, the boy, and the truth that had shattered everything she believed about her relationship with Edward. Lila had been a rock through it all, giving her the space she needed, but always ready with a kind word or a comforting embrace. She never pushed Sophie to make any decisions. "Take the time you need," Lila would say. And Sophie did. But time couldn't stop the questions from circling in her mind. Could she ever trust Edward again? Could she forgive him? Did she even want to? One afternoon, Sophie found herself in a small cafe near the park where she had fled that fateful day. The same park where she had sat, broken, after her world had fallen apart. Now, she sat by the window, staring out at the trees, trying to make sense of the chaos in her heart. She heard the cafe door open, the familiar sound of footsteps approaching her table. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She had known this moment would come eventually. Edward stood there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a quiet desperation. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and Sophie's heart clenched at the sight of him. But she forced herself to remain composed. "May I sit?" Edward asked softly, his voice fragile, as if he were afraid she would say no. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. She wasn't sure what she was ready to say, but it was time to face this. They couldn't avoid each other forever. Edward sat down across from her, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with all the unspoken words and broken promises. Finally, Edward took a deep breath. "Sophie," he began, his voice hoarse, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't even begin to cover what I've done, but I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could protect us, protect you, from my past. But I was wrong. So wrong." Sophie listened, her heart heavy. She had heard apologies before, but this felt different. She could see the guilt and regret in Edward's eyes, but she wasn't sure if it was enough. Could anything ever be enough? Edward continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I've spent the last few days thinking about everything. About you, about my son, about the lies I told. I never should have kept him from you. I was scared that if you knew, you'd leave me. But in hiding the truth, I lost you anyway. And that's the thing I regret most." Sophie swallowed, her throat tight. She had loved Edward deeply, but love wasn't the same thing as trust. And that trust had been shattered. Still, she couldn't ignore the raw honesty in his words. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Sophie said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You kept something so important from me, Edward. How am I supposed to trust you after that?" Edward nodded, his face filled with pain. I know I broke your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me easily. But I want you to know, I'm not running anymore. I've met with Rebecca. I've spent time with my son. I'm doing what I should have done from the beginning. I want to be a father to him, Sophie, and I want to be the man you deserve." Sophie's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, but also a glimmer of something softer, something that hadn't completely died. "You should have done that from the start," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You shouldn't have waited until everything fell apart to do the right thing." Edward looked down at his hands, shame flooding him. "You're right. I failed you. I failed him. But I'm trying to fix that now. I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I had to see you. I had to tell you that I'm not giving up on being a better man, even if it's too late for us." Sophie was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, could see the change in his eyes. But the hurt was still there, raw and pulsing beneath the surface. "I don't know what I want," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, but I still care about you. That's what makes this so hard." Edward's breath hitched, and he looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Sophie, if there's even the smallest chance that we can find a way back to each other, I'll do whatever it takes. I know I don't deserve it, but I love you. I always will." Sophie's heart ached. She still loved him, despite everything. But love wasn't enough to heal the wounds they had inflicted on each other. Not yet. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor as she stepped away from the table. "I need more time, Edward," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I need to figure out who I am without you before I can even think about what comes next." Edward nodded, his heart heavy but understanding. "Take all the time you need," he whispered. "I'll wait for as long as it takes." Sophie gave him a small, sad smile. She wasn't sure if time would be enough to fix what was broken, but she knew she needed to try to heal, try to rediscover herself. As she walked out of the cafe, Sophie felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't over, not yet, but it wasn't the end either. There was still a path forward, even if she didn't know where it would lead. And for now, that was enough. Months passed, and slowly, the world began to feel normal again for Sophie. She spent time focusing on herself, reconnecting with old friends, diving into new hobbies, and rediscovering who she was outside of the relationship that had once defined her. Edward, true to his word, continued to reach out gently, giving her space while also showing that he was serious about changing. He spent more time with his son, forging a bond that should have existed from the start. Sophie saw the difference in him, a man who had faced his past and was trying to grow from it. One afternoon, Sophie found herself back at the cafe, sitting by the same window where she had spoken to Edward months before. She had thought long and hard about what she wanted, about whether she could rebuild the trust that had been broken. When Edward walked in, his eyes met hers immediately. He smiled, a smile filled with hope and patience. He walked over and sat down across from her, just like he had before. This time, though, there was no desperation in his gaze, only quiet understanding. Sophie took a deep breath and met his eyes. "I'm not sure where we'll end up," she began softly, "but I think I'm ready to try again." Edward's eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "That's all I could ever ask for," he whispered. And as they sat together, both a little older, a little wiser, Sophie realized that healing was never a straight line. It was messy and painful, full of setbacks and doubts, but it was also full of hope. Maybe they could rebuild. Maybe they couldn't. But either way, Sophie knew she was strong enough to face whatever came next.